All right, so this is the first of two. This week and next will be on the book of Esther, the second book in the Old Testament named by a woman. And we'll study Esther. And then after that, we're going to move into the New Testament because our goal is to complete our Women in the Bible study by the end of October. So if you look at mid-November. So into October and November. And then after that, we'll do something else. We'll think of something. So though Esther is about twice as long as Ruth, we'll cover it in 2 weeks. We're going to skip a lot of parts, but you'll get the gist. And by next week, I'm sure you'll be ready to move on to the New Testament. Okay? So the interesting thing about Esther is just kind of orient you. It's in the Old Testament, right before Job. So if you hit Job, you're too far. Right after Nehemiah. Thank you. Ezra and Nehemiah, that's right. So if you hit Ezra and Nehemiah, keep going. And the reason why it's between Job and Nehemiah is because this takes place a little bit after Ezra and Nehemiah. So just to give you kind of some history, all right? The Jews, remember last week I talked about Jezebel and how Israel split into 2 different kingdoms. The northern kingdom called Israel, the southern kingdom called Judah. Well, they sinned a lot. And God judged them and punished them by having the Babylonians come in and wipe them out. So the Babylonians carted all the nobility and administrators off to Babylon. We call that the Babylonian exile. Well, after so many skirmishes, the Assyrians, which are the Persians, finally rose to power, the Persians, under King Cyrus. And King Cyrus was deemed a hero by the Jews because King Cyrus passed a decree that the Jews can go back and rebuild Israel. Ezra and Nehemiah lead that charge. Nehemiah, the great administrator, is the one who's in charge of rebuilding the temple. Ezra is the priest who revitalizes and revives the Torah and Torah observation. Just as an aside, Torah means law. That's the first 5 books of the Bible. And Ezra and Nehemiah bring reform to that. But there are many Jews who are throughout the known world. Not every Jew went back to Israel. Esther comes along a little bit after that time. So King Cyrus dies, and eventually we get King Xerxes, who in our scripture is named after a dinosaur, Ahasuerus. Just kidding. I always think there's a dinosaur in the Bible, Ahasuerus. And you probably don't say it like that. It's probably some phonetic name, but I'll just do it for sake of convenience. But King Ahasuerus, also known as Xerxes the First, comes to power, and that's what Esther takes place. So that's the reason why it's there within our Bible. In the Hebrew Bible has the Esther in what's called the writings. So you have 3 parts of the Hebrew Bible. This is the Old Testament. Okay, the Old Testament. The law, you have the prophets, which covers the kings and Samuel and all that. And then you have the writings, which covers books like Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, but Esther is also back there. The reason why it's in the writings is because the Hebrews had a really hard time of deciding whether or not to put Esther in the Bible. In fact, of all the books we found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, Esther was not among the books in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So what we find is that the rabbis are still fighting well into year 200 AD. This is 200 years after Jesus, as to whether or not Esther should be considered scripture in the Hebrew Bible. And by that time, the Christians were using the Greek translation. I know this gets confusing, so I'm going to go try to take this piece at a time. The Christians were using the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. But the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible included Esther. The thing about the Greek Bible is that version of Esther included 100 more scripture, or 100 more verses. So if you go to a Catholic Bible, or a Greek Orthodox Bible, the Catholic Bible actually includes a longer version of Esther than what you have in your Bible. So what happened? when the Reformation happened, Martin Luther and John Calvin, the reformers said, well, we want to undo everything the Catholics did. And what we want to do is we want to go back to the original Bible. So what the reformers did was skip over the Catholic Bible and went back to the original Hebrew Bible, because they believed that the Jewish Bible, the Hebrew Bible, was more accurate. And they realized that the Hebrew Bible had the short Esther, so they threw out the longer Esther. They also threw out 1st and 2nd Maccabees and a lot of other books that Catholics have that we don't have. So when you look at the Catholic Bible, there are about 8 or 9 more books because the reformers threw them out. Those 8 or 9 books are not in the Hebrew Bible. That's why they got thrown out. Now, Martin Luther and John Calvin didn't really like Esther anyway. And if you read their commentary on the Bible, they don't do any commentaries on Esther. So they don't like Esther anyway. So that's kind of the storied history of Esther. Now, I say all that because I think it's important. Well, you say, well, who cares about Esther and all that? It's the only reason why that's important is I want to show you how the formation of the Bible came about, because it really is interesting. Like, how did we get the books we got? Why do Catholics have more? Why do we have fewer? Things like that. So I think that's interesting. Now, the thing about Esther is nowhere in the book is God mentioned. And that's really the theological argument that Jews have had when they said, well, it shouldn't be included. They did include it, by the way, obviously, eventually. But the argument was, well, God is not in the Bible, or not mentioned in the book, so why include it? F.B. Meyer, is the quote here, says, the peculiarity of this book is that I'm sorry, I misspelled there. There is no mention of the name of God, but there is no book in the Bible more full of the presence and working of God. His name is clearly in the watermark of the paper. I thought that was a pretty neat quote. A little bit of hyperbole, but a little bit exaggerated, but pretty neat, I thought. Nice, witty, okay? And we can see the movement of God in the book. Now, the other historical thing I want to mention is that this is considered one of 5 in the Hebrew Bible, one of 5 what are called festival or festal scrolls. Does anybody know the other book that we read and studied that is a festal scroll? Read during a holiday, Jewish holiday? Women in the Bible, the only other book we've studied that has a named after a woman. Ruth? Yeah, Ruth. Ruth is another festival scroll. Remember, I mentioned to you that the Ruth is read during the time of Succoth, or the harvest festival, because Boaz and Ruth with all the harvesting and the barley and the grain. So Jews read it during the festival of harvest. Well, Esther is read during the holiday of Purim. Okay? Purim comes from the word pure. Not pure like we think, it's pure, it's Hebrew, for lots. Because when Haman, we're going to learn about in a minute, cast lots to figure out when to kill all the Jews, he threw the lots, like dice almost, the Purim, and so that's how Haman decided when he was going to commit genocide against all the Jews. So it's called Purim. And we have little ears here, so I'll try to figure out how to say this. Purim is a very fun holiday in the Jewish church, in the Jewish synagogue. And the thing about Purim is, it is not a holiday you want to attend if you're going to AA, because part of the celebration is that, and this is historic. This isn't just like contemporary. This isn't like this isn't a contemporary. This goes all the way back. Every time Haman's name is said, you're supposed to, and that's how it goes. I talked to Rabbi Michael, our local rabbi, about this, and he said, yeah, we don't really do that because it really has been like a struggle for people. So, we just play it safe and we eat and drink, but we don't do like every time Haman's name is mentioned. So, but the festival is actually a big part of the book, and if you read the last chapter, which gives the whole book away, so we're not, but if you read it later, you'll see that the book says you're to observe this every year because of this heroic couple, or this heroic woman by the name of Esther and her cousin Mordecai. Okay? All right, so that's the history on it. All right? When you read Esther, what themes are you going to see? Well, a lot like Ruth. It's very similar to Ruth in that the theme is on family and loyalty. Why? Well, if you think about Ruth, okay, the book of Ruth, where the Jews are in a strange land and they have to try to make do in a pagan land, the same thing is true of Esther. Esther is written to Jews who are in exile, okay, in a pagan land, in Persia and Egypt and elsewhere. And the goal of the book of Esther is to teach good Jewish boys and girls of what it means to be loyal to your faith and loyal to your family as Jews living in a strange land. So you're going to see, like Ruth, loyalty and family incorporated in the preservation of the Jewish faith, as well as God's intervention in the safety and protection of the Jewish faith. Another thing about Esther is it has themes much like Ruth. Do you all remember when we talked about Ruth, I talked to you about satire and irony in the Old Testament? That the Hebrew Bible, I also brought this up for Jezebel and Ahab and Elijah. The Hebrew Bible utilizes satire and irony, and in some cases what we call hyperbole, which is exaggeration, in order to buffoon the villains and to really highlight the heroism of the heroes. In the book of Esther, hyperbole and reversal, like parables, you know how Jesus tells a parable and the rich become poor and the poor become rich kind of stuff? You're going to see that there's reversal and hyperbole, a lot of exaggeration in the book of Esther, because the emphasis is on telling a good story. Remember, this story is to be read during a festival in which you're supposed to party and eat and every time Haman's name is said. So the story is written in a very, kind of a very captivating way. A lot of drama, a lot of action, and a lot of good storytelling elements to it. So that's another theme. Another thing is, you've heard of coming of age stories where people come of age, and realize they move from a child to an adult. Well, a lot of people see this as a coming of faith story, where Esther grows into her faith and the importance of what it means to be tied to this peculiar people called the Hebrew Jewish people, and what the risks are, and what the kind of courage it requires to stand up for your people. And of course, again, when you tell the story, little boys and little girls are supposed to be reading this and saying, "Yeah, if I was Esther, I would do it too." This is the superhero book. This is really the superhero movie in the Old Testament. We have Batman and Superman, and little kids aspire to be like Superman. Well, Esther is that hero to whom we're supposed to aspire, as little Jewish boys and little Jewish girls would hear this story. Okay, so it's a coming of faith story. And then another one is banquets and celebrations. There are 10 banquets that run throughout Esther. And like a Christmas tree, which holds different ornaments, the story and plot of Esther hangs on these banquets. The middle banquet, the 5th one, is the one where Haman decides and passes a decree that he's going to kill all of the Jews. So the middle one. So the first 4 banquets are moving to Esther and Ahasuerus' kind of relationship. There's the decree, which is the 5th banquet. And then the last 4 banquets is the undoing of the decree and the downfall of Haman. Okay, so every time you say it. Let's jump into Esther 1 and 2. I am just going to summarize for you Esther 1. Again, we're not going to read every part, but Esther 1, it opens up with King Ahasuerus. It's Ahasuerus, so again, Ahasuerus is fine with me. And his current wife, Vashti, thank you. Vashti, the characters in here are really interesting because Ahasuerus there's a celebration. This is the first banquet feast. And they're all, partying half the night. And Vashti's very beautiful. And he wants to parade Vashti around and show her off to his friends, his, rich friends. And Vashti says, yeah, I'm not an object. You're not going to parade me around. So she refuses, and he gets mad, and he casts her away. Okay? And then we get to chapter 2. We're going to read verses 1 through 11. All right? Chapter 2, 1 through 11. After these things, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had abated, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's servants who attended him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king, and let the king appoint commissioners in all the provinces of his kingdom, to gather all the beautiful young girls to the harem in the citadel of Susa, under custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women. Let their, I don't know what you may have, but my Bible says cosmetic treatments be given them." Cosmetic, which is kind of a whole regimen of like oils and spices and bathing and stuff like that. Okay, not just like rouge. It's like a whole thing. "And let the girl who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." This pleased the king, and he did so. So you can see like a lot of power here. And again, there's an objectification going on here, if you don't pick it up. All right? I'm sure you can pick that up. Okay. Now there was a Jew in the citadel of Susa. By the way, Susa is the capital of Persia, whose name was Mordecai, son of Jair, son of Shammai, son of Kish, a Benjaminite. Now we know the Benjaminites. That's where David came from, right? So good tribe. Always the underdogs. Kish had been carried. David was a Benjaminite, right? I think he was, yeah. All right, Kish had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives, carried away with King Jeconiah Jeconiah of Judah, whom King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon had carried away. That's all that stuff I told you about. Mordecai had brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his cousin. All right, so the story opens much like a Charles Dickens novel, in which you have Mordecai raising his cousin who is an orphan. Now, not only is Esther a woman, but she's an orphan. And we're going to find that the orphan woman is the one who's going to come to not only power, but the hero of the story, which is really neat because she has two strikes against her. She's a woman, and this time, no voice. And two, she's an orphan. But her cousin raises her, and I think that's, again, a kind of a Charles Dickens kind of story. Hadassah is her Jewish name. Means myrtle. Does anybody want to tell any stories about a Hadassah in their family? Mitzi?
I have a great-granddaughter. Her name is Hadassah.
What's her full name?
Caroline Hadassah. They call her Caroline. But there was much prayer about her before she was born 10 years ago. She had heart surgery before she was born.
Yeah, that's right. We pray for her. So Mitzi's granddaughter's middle name is Hadassah, which means myrtle, like the myrtle tree or the myrtle bush, which stands for courage and strength. Okay. Her Greek name is Esther, which comes from possible two Greek words, or root words, I'm sorry. One is Ishtar, which is the goddess of, I have it here somewhere. No, I didn't include it here. Goddess of something or another. And the other root is Stella, which is star. So her name can mean the goddess of something, Ishtar, I have to look it up, and then star. All right. Okay, for she had neither father nor mother. The girl was fair and beautiful. I want you to look at this. This is verse 7. I'm still in verse 7. She was fair and beautiful. Anybody have any other descriptors?
Lovely in form and features.
Lovely in what?
In form and features.
In form and features, okay. Does anybody have handsome and... No? Well, this same exact phrase is used for Joseph, in which Joseph is described as the very same thing. But in the English translation, Joseph isn't described as fair and beautiful. He's described as handsome and strong. But it's the same exact word. Now, what's interesting is why would the storyteller go out of his or her way, probably his way, to make a connection between Esther and Joseph? What's the correlation, right? You remember Joseph, kicked out of the family, went to Egypt, rose to power, right? So there's a correlation between Joseph and Esther, not to mention the reason why the Jews came to Egypt and ran back into Joseph was because of a famine. and because of the bread of Egypt. So there's a lot of eating and stuff in here, which recalls that kind of nourishment that they got in Egypt under Joseph. So there are a lot of Joseph and Esther connections in both language and themes. When her father and mother died, Mordecai adopted her as his own daughter. Let's see. So when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in the citadel of Susa in custody of Hegai, Esther also was taken to the king's palace and put in custody of Hegai, who had charge of the women. The girl pleased him and won his favor, and he quickly provided her with cosmetic treatments and her portion of food, and with 7 chosen maids from the king's palace, and advanced her and her maids to the best place in the harem. There's that other word for harem. Remember we talked about harem a few months ago, which wasn't the harem? This is the harem now, that's the harem. You remember the harem, when I said it was the harem? Anyway, all right. Never mind. There's a harem with an E, which is wiping out a people, and there's a harem with an A, which is a group of women. Okay, verse 10. Esther did not reveal her people or kindred, for Mordecai had charged her not to tell. Every day Mordecai would walk around in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and how she fared. Okay? All right, let's go to verses 16 through 18. Skip ahead a little bit. When Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus in his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth in the 7th year of his reign, the king loved Esther more than all of the other women. Of all of the other young women, she won his favor and devotion. You might have other words for young women, but I'm just sticking with young women for now. So that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. It should probably be in place of Vashti, but then the king gave a great banquet to all of his officials and ministers, Esther's banquet. So here's another banquet, okay? He also granted a holiday to the provinces and gave gifts with royal liberality. All right, so there's a banquet, and there's now Esther's banquet. So there's a banquet in her favor. All right. Then if you go on, the rest of chapter 2, which we'll skip, but I'll summarize, Mordecai is still kind of hanging around Susa, and he hears of a conspiracy in which some eunuchs are going to kill the king. So Mordecai tells Esther, who tells the king, and therefore foils the plot. So Mordecai saves the king's life from an assassination attempt as we go through chapter 2. So it raises Mordecai's kind of standing before the king. That's kind of a plot there that is important because later the king will honor Mordecai and know Mordecai. Okay, but we're going to skip to chapter 3 and 4. Okay, any questions before we move on? All right, we're moving right along. Good. All right, chapter 3, verse 1 through 11. After these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him and set his seat above all the officials who were with him. And all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and did obeisance to Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai did not bow down or do obeisance. When the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, "Why do you disobey the king's command? Why do you disobey the king's command?" When they spoke to him day after day, he would not listen to them. They told Haman, in order to see whether Mordecai's words would avail. For he had told them that he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down and do obeisance to him, Haman was infuriated. I'm doing that for a reason, to see how these parties go. Haman was infuriated. Verse 6, but he thought it beneath him to lay hands on Mordecai alone. So having been told who Mordecai's people were, Haman plotted to destroy all of the Jews, the people of Mordecai throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. In the first month, which is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast Pur, which means the lot. So they cast these dice, or these lots. That's where the Purim comes from. Before Haman for the day and the month, and the lot fell on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. Then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, there is a certain people scattered and separated among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of every other people, and they do not keep the king's laws, so that it is not appropriate for the king to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let the decree be issued for their destruction. Let's see here. And I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who have charge of the king's business, so they may put it into the king's treasuries. By the way, 10,000 talents is like a third of the national budget, the annual national budget for the Persian capital. So there's another kind of like, I don't want to say exaggeration, but another kind of mode of storytelling to really grab the attention of the listener. Like, that's a lot of money, you know? So like, what's our national budget? All right, let's make it easy. What's our deficit? 30 trillion? So this is like $10 trillion if you're going to talk, you know. All right, so it's a lot of money. Catches your attention. Let's see here. And the king said to, I'm going to verse 11. The king said to Haman, the money is given to you and the people as well to do with them as seems good to you. By the way, Ahasuerus comes off as a very passive king in this whole story. Not a lot of power. You know, it kind of just goes with the flow. He can't win the heart of Vashti. You know, the eunuchs tell him you should do this with the harem, and he does. He's kind of a passive leader, which again shows kind of the providence and power of God, especially when we have the rise of Esther and her voice in the story. Let's see here. By the way, a lot like the Egyptian story. Remember, like, one of the dudes came to Pharaoh and said, you know, the Israelites keep growing, and the population is more than we can bear if they were to rise up. So again, a lot of similarities between the Egyptian Exodus story and Joseph, and then this story. All right, let's go ahead and read chapter 4, verses 1 through 5. Okay, so again, bits and pieces here. Chapter 4, verses 1 through 5. When Mordecai learned all that had been done, Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes. By the way, Ash Wednesday comes from this kind of tradition, right? And went through the city, wailing with a loud and bitter cry. He went up to the entrance of the king's gate, for no one might enter the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. In every province, wherever the king's command and his decree came, there was a great mourning among the Jews, with fasting and weeping and lamenting, and most of them lay in sackcloth and ashes. By the way, again, this is another contrast to the Purim holiday, where they're supposed to eat and celebrate, which is in direct contrast to the weeping, the fasting, and the lamenting. That's kind of the point, okay? All right, we're going to jump to verses 9 through 17. All right. Well, let's skip ahead because let's go to verse 12 in that chapter. Skip a little bit ahead. Mordecai tells Esther, by the way. When they told Mordecai what Esther had said, they talked back and forth about the decree. Okay, Mordecai tells Esther about the decree. Verse 13, Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not think that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silence, at such a time as this, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another quarter, but you and your father's family will perish. So when he says relief and deliverance will rise from the Jews from another quarter, what's that other quarter? God, right? Yeah, it'll rise from somewhere. God will rise up to protect his people. So if you don't do it and you remain silent, God will rise up and protect the Jews. But don't think your family's going to be spared just because you're in the king's palace. And not only that, you know, when you die, your whole family line goes with it because, again, she's an orphan, right? Who knows? Perhaps you have come to royal dignity for just such. Perhaps you have come to royal dignity. That is, perhaps you became the queen for just such a time as this. So what is he saying? Maybe God allowed you and permitted you to become the queen just for this moment. I'm sure you've heard sermons on this before. For such a time as this, that the saying comes from this of the Bible. So, you know, you became a queen. You know, all of this unfolded just for this moment that you can have the opportunity to shape national policy. Okay? Verse 15, then Esther said in reply to Mordecai, go gather all the Jews to be found in Susa and hold a fast on my behalf. Neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maids will also fast as you do. After that I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. By the way, this is the first time or the second or third time the second time, I think. Her voice comes in the beginning or the middle of this chapter through writing. She wrote Mordecai, or she might have responded to the eunuchs, but this is kind of the first time she's giving a speech here, I think, if I'm not mistaken. You'd have to check me on that. And the word is, if I perish, I perish, but I'm going to do this, but have everyone fast and pray. Mordecai then went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. Chapter 5, verse 1. On the third day, Esther put on royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace opposite of the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne inside the palace opposite the entrance to the palace. How many days did they fast? 3 days. Remember that messianic thread I always tell you about? Look for the messianic threads. It'll be 3 days where she goes to the king and tells the king about the decree and gives new life, to the people. So I think that's a messianic clue. Now we're supposed to read verse 9, chapter 5, verse 9 through 6:10, and talk about how Haman's decree Haman is still really mad at Mordecai. I'll summarize it for you. Haman's really upset at Mordecai. He goes home. His wife Zeresh says, "Why are you afraid of this dude? He's only Jewish. He's a commoner. Go and kill him." And Haman says, "You know what? I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go and kill this guy." Because the decree is reversed, right? And as the next morning, as Haman is walking to the palace, Ahasuerus wants to lift up Mordecai because Mordecai saved his life and because of this turn of events. And so when Haman gets there, he says, "King, why are you so happy?" Well, Mordecai did this and that, or this gentleman who we have to honor with the best robes and parade him around the town because of the good he has done, did this thing. And Haman says, "Okay, I'll do it. Who is it?" It's Mordecai, Haman's enemy. Now, the story is much better than me telling it, but you get the point. The decree is reversed, and by the time we get to chapter 6, Haman humiliates himself, or is humiliated by having to parade Mordecai around because of all of this turn of events. Let's see here. And then there's another banquet. Okay, so go to chapter 6, verse 14. While they were still talking with him, okay, let's see here. Let's read chapter 6, verse 12 through 14. Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman hurried to his house, mourning and with his head covered. When Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened to him, his advisors and his wife Zeresh said to him, "If Mordecai, before whom your downfall has begun, is of the Jewish people, you will not prevail against him, but will surely fall before him." While they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried Haman off to the banquet that Esther had prepared. So the king and Haman went into the feast with Queen Esther, and then we'll read the rest next week. So that's where we leave off. I do encourage you to read 5 and 6 because that's where all the action happens, and it's unfortunate we can't read it, but you can read this later. I invite you to read the whole first 6 chapters in full. It is a good book. We're hitting on the highlights. But again, you see this coming of faith story in which this queen gains her voice and intervenes and saves her people. All right, questions, thoughts?